Welcome back to the Echoes of Ihsan Podcast. Today we're diving into a topic that might seem a bit old-fashioned on the surface, but trust me, it's surprisingly relevant to us today. We're going to be talking about vows and oaths, and our guide for this exploration is none other than Sunan al Tirmidhi, Volume 3.
What I find so fascinating about this topic is how something that might seem so rooted in a particular religious context actually speaks to something universal. Really, it speaks to the power of our words, right, and the commitments that we make in life.
Okay, I like that. So before we get too deep into the weeds here, for listeners who might not be so familiar, can you give us a little context about Sunan al Tirmidhi, especially Volume 3? What are we dealing with here?
Absolutely. So Sunan al Tirmidhi is one of the 6 major collections of Hadith in Sunni Islam. You can kind of think of it as this carefully curated library of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions, which were compiled by Imam al Tirmidhi. Volume 3 is particularly interesting because it gives us a window into practical Islamic rulings on a huge range of topics. We're talking about business transactions, legal matters, even things like hunting and sacrifices, all sorts of things. And within this volume, we find some really insightful teachings on vows and oaths.
So we're not dealing with, some dry, legalistic text here. It sounds like it's a source of practical wisdom that we can still draw on today, even centuries later.
Yeah.
I'm curious, why does Islamic tradition place such a strong emphasis on oaths and vows? What makes them so significant?
Well, in Islam, oaths and vows are seen as really serious commitments, especially when they're made in the name of Allah. It's about recognizing the weight of our words, and understanding that our speech can have real consequences, not just in this world, but also in the hereafter. Ultimately, it's about building trust and accountability, not just in our relationships with each other, but also in our relationship with Allah.
So it's not just about, trying to avoid some kind of punishment, right? It sounds like it's more about cultivating a much deeper sense of integrity and recognizing that your word is your bond.
You put it perfectly. It's about striving to embody truthfulness in both our speech and actions. And Sunan al Tirmidhi offers us some really compelling examples that illustrate this point beautifully.
I'm all about a good example. Let's hear it.
Okay, so there's this hadith narrated by Ibn Umar. In it, the Prophet Muhammad actually prohibits the selling or conferring of something called wald. Now, wald was basically this type of informal agreement that was pretty common back in the Prophet's time, and this prohibition really underscores just how much emphasis Islam places on honoring agreements, even ones that seem kind of casual at first,
Yeah.
It reminds us that our words have power, right? And we should use them thoughtfully.
So even if it's not like a formal legal contract, the principle is the same. You honor your word in all your dealing.
Exactly. It's about establishing a pattern of trustworthiness that affects every aspect of our lives. This principle is emphasized even further by another hadith in Volume 3. This one's narrated by Abu Dar. In it, the Prophet Muhammad lists 3 types of people that Allah will not even look at on the Day of Judgment.
Okay, I'm really curious. Tell me more about these 3 types of people.
Well, the Shaitan mentions the manan. This is a person who boasts about their charity. It also mentions the person who lets their lower garment hang below their ankles out of arrogance. And, most relevant to our conversation today, it mentions the person who promotes their merchandise with a false oath.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
That paints a pretty stark picture. Making a false oath to sell something is clearly not something to be taken lightly.
It really shows you how important honesty and transparency are, especially when it comes to trade and commerce. Imagine a marketplace where nobody trusts each other's word. I mean, the whole system would just fall apart.
Yeah, it would be chaos. It's about more than just individual morality here, right? It's about creating this foundation of trust so that society can actually function. Which makes me wonder, what happens when things don't go according to plan? What if something unexpected happens that makes it hard to keep a vow? Is there any room for flexibility in Islamic tradition?
That's a great question. And Islamic teachings definitely acknowledge how complex life can be. You're right. Fulfilling vows is highly encouraged. But there are situations where breaking a vow might be permissible. Of course, this isn't something to be taken lightly. There are nuances and specific guidelines to consider.
So it's not like you have a free pass to break a promise whenever it's convenient. There's a process involved. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Of course. One of the key concepts here is the importance of acknowledging Allah's will. There's this fascinating hadith in Sunan al Tirmidhi about Suleiman bin Dawood, the son of Prophet Dawood. Suleiman vowed to sleep with 100 women, all in a single night.
That's ambitious, to say the least.
It is, isn't it? But you see, the hadith explains that he actually failed to fulfill this vow, and it was all because he left out a crucial phrase. if Allah wills, which is inshallah in Arabic. This omission really highlights the idea that although we can make plans and have intentions, the ultimate fulfillment of our vows rests with Allah's will, and it's important to acknowledge that.
It reminds us that we're not really in complete control, even when we make these vows.
Exactly. And this concept of conditional oaths, where we acknowledge Allah's will, is actually explicitly mentioned in another hadith from Sunan al Tirmidhi. In this hadith, Prophet Muhammad states that whoever swears an oath and says, if Allah wills, then there is no breaking of the oath against him.
So adding inshallah is kind of like a safeguard. It acknowledges the possibility of the unexpected. It allows for flexibility without undermining the importance of the oath itself.
Exactly. It strikes a balance between our accountability and the realities of human experience.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm still curious about those situations where breaking a vow might be permissible. Are there any examples in Sunan al Tirmidhi that show us how this works in practice?
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely examples in Sunan al Tirmidhi that offer us some insight into these situations where breaking a vow might be permissible.
Can you walk us through one? I'm really curious to see how these principles actually play out, in a real-life scenario.
Sure. There's this really compelling hadith that's narrated by Uqba bin Amir. He talks about his sister who made this vow to walk to the Kaaba barefoot and without a khimar, a head covering.
Wow. That sounds like it would be incredibly difficult, especially considering, the climate and the terrain and everything.
It definitely would have been an incredibly arduous journey. And when the Prophet Muhammad heard about this vow, he actually advised her to ride, to cover her head, and to fast for 3 days instead.
Oh, interesting. So he offered her a less physically demanding alternative, but he still acknowledged the spirit of her vow through the act of fasting.
Exactly. It shows us that the Prophet Muhammad really considered the individual circumstances and their well-being. He provided a more feasible way for her to fulfill the essence of her vow without causing undue hardship. This hadith is a powerful reminder that Islamic rulings often prioritize compassion and practicality alongside, strict adherence to principles.
It seems to suggest that blindly sticking to a vow, especially if it's going to cause harm or hardship, isn't really the most important thing, right? It's more about understanding the deeper intention behind it and finding a way to fulfill it that aligns with other Islamic principles.
You've hit the nail on the head, and that actually leads us to another important concept that's highlighted in Sunan al Tirmidhi, this idea of a hierarchy of obligations in Islam. You see, fulfilling vows is definitely encouraged, but it should never come at the expense of neglecting more fundamental duties.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you give me an example of what you mean by this hierarchy of obligations?
Absolutely. There's a hadith in Sunan al Tirmidhi where this man comes to the Prophet Muhammad. He's seeking permission to participate in jihad, which is, considered a very virtuous act in Islam. But when the Prophet finds out that the man has elderly parents who depend on him, he actually advises him to prioritize serving his parents instead.
Oh, wow. So in that situation, taking care of his parents was more important than participating in jihad, even though both are seen as good deeds.
Precisely. This highlights the fact that fulfilling certain obligations, like caring for your parents, actually takes precedence over others, even obligations that might seem, more outwardly spiritual or noble.
I see. It's interesting how this concept of a hierarchy of obligations brings a sense of balance and pragmatism to Islamic teachings. It acknowledges that life is messy, right? And sometimes we have to make these tough choices and weigh different values against each other.
I think you've grasped the essence of it perfectly. It's about seeking guidance from Islamic principles to navigate the complexities of life in a way that, honors both our individual well-being and our responsibilities to others. And this actually leads us to another really important point, which is, the broader implications of this whole emphasis on oaths and vows in Islam.
Okay, tell me more about these broader implications.
Well, this meticulous attention to truthfulness in oaths and vows, it actually extends far beyond just these specific acts. It's really about laying the groundwork for honesty as a fundamental principle that should govern every area of our lives.
So it's kind of like a ripple effect, right?
Yeah.
The emphasis on truthfulness in one area ends up influencing our behavior in other areas as well.
You got it. It fosters this mindset where honesty isn't just, some abstract virtue. It's a way of life. It's about understanding that our words have real power and that we have this responsibility to use them in a way that upholds truth and integrity.
This makes me think about the concept of Ihsan that we talk about a lot on this show. How does Ihsan connect to this idea of honesty as a way of life?
I love that connection. Ihsan, remember, is all about striving for excellence and sincerity in everything we do. It's about acting with this deep awareness, almost as if Allah is watching us, which of course He is. And this applies beautifully to how we use our words. Ihsan in speech means speaking truthfully, thoughtfully, and with the intention of benefiting others. It means avoiding things like gossip, backbiting, and any kind of harmful speech.
So it's not just about avoiding telling outright lies. It's about being much more intentional with our speech, using our words to build trust, spread kindness, and create a more positive environment for everyone.
You said it perfectly. And it highlights how Islamic teachings on oaths and vows, which might seem very specific at first, actually connect to a much broader principle, cultivating honesty and ihsan in every single aspect of our lives.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. We've covered so much ground already, from the weightiness of oaths and vows, the complexities of breaking them, to the idea of fulfilling those higher obligations. And of course, we talked about how all this ties into this overarching emphasis on honesty in Islam. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how this emphasis on honesty actually translates into actions and behaviors in Islamic tradition. Like, what does it look like in practice?
That's a great point, and it leads us to some really fascinating examples from Sunan al Tirmidhi that show how this commitment to honesty shows up in various aspects of daily life.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about these examples. Let's get into it in part 3 of our deep dive. I'm eager to hear these examples. What can you tell us about how honesty shows up in these everyday situations?
Well, we talked earlier about the hadith that condemns the practice of anash, essentially, artificially inflating prices in the marketplace.
Right. That's where someone tricks people into paying more than they should, right?
Exactly. The Prophet Muhammad really condemned this practice. And it serves as a reminder that honesty isn't just about keeping personal promises, right? It extends to business, to financial transactions, all those things too.
It sounds like Islam really values fairness and transparency, not just in what we say, but also in how we act.
Absolutely. It's about understanding that honesty is the foundation of trust in the marketplace. In the long run, it benefits everyone involved, both the buyers and the sellers.
That makes sense. What other examples are there?
Well, there's another hadith that focuses on the importance of clear communication and consent. This hadith states that both the buyer and seller can actually annul a sale, as long as they haven't separated or explicitly agreed to finalize the deal.
So it's like giving both sides a chance to, reconsider and make sure they're really happy with the terms of the agreement.
Exactly. It's about preventing any kind of pressure or coercion in business dealings. Making sure everything is done with mutual consent and understanding. It's a great example of how Islamic teachings promote these ethical business practices that prioritize fairness and transparency.
All these examples really show that Islam sees honesty as this foundational principle for a just and flourishing society.
Yeah.
It's not just about staying out of trouble. It's about creating a culture of trust and integrity that benefits everyone.
That's a really profound insight. And it's important to remember that these principles go beyond just business. Islamic teachings really emphasize honesty in all our social interactions. How we speak to our family and friends, even how we interact with complete strangers.
So honesty isn't just for big formal agreements. It's part of everyday life.
Precisely. Whether we're sharing our opinions or giving advice or even just having a casual conversation, we're encouraged to be truthful, avoid gossip or backbiting, and choose words that are kind and beneficial.
It's about recognizing that our words really do have power and that we have a responsibility to use them in a way that promotes understanding, compassion, and just a more positive social environment for everyone.
I like how you put that. It brings us back to that concept of ihsan we've been discussing. Remember, ihsan is about striving for excellence and sincerity in all that we do, and that includes how we speak. Ihsan in speech is about being mindful of our words, choosing them carefully, and using them to uplift others, ultimately to create a more harmonious world.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've gone deep into the world of vows and oaths, discussed the complexities of breaking them, the importance of prioritizing higher obligations, and we've tied all of this back to that fundamental Islamic emphasis on honesty as a core principle for a just and thriving society.
And I hope this discussion leaves you with a renewed awareness of the power of your own words and the commitments you make. Whether you're promising something, engaging in a business transaction, or even just chatting with someone, remember the wisdom we've explored today. Strive for honesty, act with integrity, and let your words reflect the beauty of a sun.
It's a good reminder that even in today's world, Honesty is still a powerful force for good. It builds trust, it strengthens relationships, and it helps create a more ethical and harmonious society for everyone. I want to thank you so much for walking us through this deep dive. It's been a truly enlightening experience.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, as you go about your day, think about the power of your words and the importance of aligning them with truthfulness and integrity. May your speech always be a source of goodness and a reflection of the beauty in your heart.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of Islamic teachings. May this deep dive inspire us all to embrace honesty, speak with integrity, and strive for excellence in all that we do.